Well, welcome to another live episode of The Dental Guys. I'm Wes, the Dental Guy.
And I'm John, the Dental Guy, and we are back. I mean, we're just every night, Wes, just hitting it hard. And this is a really cool opportunity that we got. We were talking to some folks from Southern Implants and some good people there. And, you know, I went about a year ago to an event that they put on where Dr. Stephen Chu was introducing Inverta over in Charlotte. And, very interesting design. We actually, it's funny, Wes, because if you go back on our Facebook page about 2 years ago, when the original article was published in IJPRD that showed the histology of this implant, we actually posted a picture from that. I put it up there because it was like, is this the future? And here we are a couple years later where
we got an FDA approved implant.
Yeah, this brand new implant design is out there, and it's an interesting design. And so we just got off the webinar that Dr. Chu and Nick Egbert and a couple of other people were on talking about this implant. And Wes,
first of all, thanks for watching this tonight. Thanks for watching tonight, right? If you're tuning in live for this, we appreciate you staying up a little past your bedtime, maybe. I don't know. Maybe you're watching this overseas, right? But
yeah, you never know.
You just ate dinner and you're tuning in, and I appreciate those that are watching us. If you have questions during the live stream about this Inverta implant, we'd be happy to answer them. And as far as we know and what we understand about the Inverta implant, we'll answer them in that way. We're not working for Southern Implants. Let's just go ahead and get that out there. We will not receive endorsement for this. But we
just think it's interesting.
We think it's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it could be a game changer. So Wes, let's talk about what Inverta is before we get into what Dr. Chu presented.
Inverta is essentially a tapered implant that has been moved apically with a narrow body stuck on top of it, right? It's kind of like an ultra wide body, right, at the apex,
apically,
right? And so you have the lower 60% of the implant is like a wide body implant, and then the upper coronal 40% of the implant is a narrow straight walled implant. Now, here's the thing, is that if you place implants, I want you to understand something long enough, and you've been around implants long enough, that you begin to understand that there's not one implant that fits most scenarios. You're going to have, I texted John the other day, I said, John, I'm so glad that I have a few systems in my office. Didn't I say that? Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. And the reason why is because we're dealing with anatomy here. Now, let's talk about Inverta, where you would use something like this. This is, for all intents and purposes, this is an immediate extraction, immediate placement implant that's intended in most situations to be used in areas number 4 through number 13 because of the way the maxilla leans in, right? It's kind of like position when you say like towards like the sinus, and it buttresses out away from the palate. So if you can engage that bone that is towards the palate and still, okay, here's the thing, and still maintain volume of tissue post-surgically. Right?
Right.
Because in order to maintain...
If you go back to reading through Dr. Chu and Dr. Tarnow and their group over the years, as they've kind of developed this approach to treating the single central, right? Like the maxillary central, the classic papers, they've tried to figure out how to get the implant three-dimensionally in a position that gives you the highest rate of success of maintaining midfacial tissue, volume, and height. And, this led to the development of the dual zone socket concept, which basically is for, if you haven't seen this before, the idea being that if you extract a tooth, you place the implant toward the palate, you have a gap, and you would graft that gap down into the bone zone, which is, of course, below the bone, subcrestal. and also up into the tissue zone. And then if you use a provisional or a custom healing abutment that supports that tissue, they've shown that you maintain and even can augment tissue thickness. And so the idea is you want to have a gap. And what Dr. Chu talked about is kind of this implant is sort of the culmination of that whole dual zone thought process. As Wes said, first, it's about putting the implant where the bone is, number one, but then you don't want the top of that implant emerging right through toward the facial and being too thick often to basically occlude the entire socket. And Dr. Chu said, one thing I took early on from this was, in order to have stability long-term, because all the question that we've had about dual zone, Wes, has been about how long is it going to be stable? How long is it going to last? Because we have data on connective tissue grafting, but he's talking about some published research that says you need to have 1.5 to 2 millimeters of bone tissue, facial, in order to establish blood supply in the bone, in order to establish to have marrow space and have predictable bones stay there. So how do you do that? Well, you need a small implant. You need a small implant at the coronal, but you don't want a small implant at the apex because, as he showed, that decreases your initial stability. So this implant's designed to say, well, you get stability in where you want it, but then you have a nice narrow neck. And then if you take it to the next level where they do with a coaxis approach of having a shift and angle correction built into the implant, you can even angle correct palatal in order to maybe achieve screw retention without
so if you're listening to this
crazy stuff.
What you're thinking is, well, how narrow do you really need to go? Well, John and I, we've been practicing for long enough to know that it used to be, hey, let's just get it wide because we need stability, right? And we were putting in 5 millimeter diameter implants in central incisors and 4s in lateral incisors and sometimes 5s in canines that you wanted to immediately provisionalize, immediately load because you needed stability. Because when you use a tapered implant or even a straight-walled implant, the availability of bone because of the narrow, or the availability of bone to implant contact because of a narrow body implant is not as great as a wide body implant. Simple. So you would just choose, hey, we're going to do a 5 millimeter implant in a central, a 5 in a canine. But the problem is not initially, right? And this is where I really think that good implant training comes in play, right? Understanding, one, not only the biology, John, but I think it's also understanding engineering principles about why implant designs, and he hit on this because he talked a little bit about threads, and we can get into that later, but it's understanding not just the biology, but it's merging the biology with why are things the way they are. It's an intentional design, and that's what Inverta is. It is an intentional design. The way it was designed is to narrow the coronal portion so that you do have what John's talking about, this 1.5 to 2 millimeters to the facial or buccal of the implant body. So we're talking about that top part of this Inverta can be anywhere from like 3.5 to 4 millimeters. Now, the other day, case in point, John, on Friday, I did an extraction on a young man, took out number 9, had a periapical radiolucency that wrapped around the apex and up through the facial. The buccal plate, it was a class 2B, 2C, it was about a 2C socket. At that point in time, I chose to do an ice cream cone technique, and I had to bail. And I was doing a guided surgery, and to achieve stability in this case, I went ahead and went through my drilling sequence. Guess how long my implant had to be? 17 millimeters. And guess what I'm thinking about at this same time? I have to be very careful, and this is why I did guided, that I don't perf at the apical portion of that osteotomy. If I would have had Inverta, John, I would have had Inverta, guess what? That guy would have walked out of there with at least a custom tissue former. because you can achieve stability. Now, guess what stability they're saying that you're achieving on a mean average over 274 implants, was it, John? It was like 80 Newton centimeters.
Yeah, they're routinely placing this implant at 80 to 100, and he made the case that, this implant's designed for high insertional torque. But before that makes you nervous, and you've heard this talk about this on the show before, but for those of you who haven't heard our discussion on that, and he covered this in the webinar, it's all about where you're putting that torque. And one of the things that's great about this implant is you're not engaging the cortical plate, right? You're not putting torque onto the facial plate, onto really any cortical bone. All that torque is being transmitted to medullary bone with high blood supply. And we know from the studies that he cited, that we've talked about, that you can apply a tremendous amount of torque to medullary bone with no ill effects. But if you start applying that torque, as we've said before, if everything's loosey-goosey and that last millimeter you're putting the implant in, all of a sudden you go from 0 to 100, you're probably going to lose that. Yeah, that's not good. But this implant is applying torque where you want that torque, which is in that high blood supply medullary bone, which is pretty sweet. And like you say, Wes, that could have changed your case. And I'm looking at cases that I've done where we've had similar situation, compromised sockets where it's a wide blown out socket at the apex. And, we know from Joe Kahn's work on sagittal root position, oftentimes the root on these, if you look sagittally, is coming out, bending out toward the facial. And you might have now an apical lucency there. You might have bone loss. What I wouldn't give for a nice fat apical implant that I could place toward the direction I want and get stability, because there's no way you're going to get that without trying to go to a super long implant.
So you all have seen the pictures, right? And I've got them in my lectures of the implants sticking out of the lateral incisors. And this is like from the 90s, right? And it is like sitting on a desktop of a lab tech, and they're saying, how the heck do I restore this with these implants looking at me? So you know what bone they engage, John? They engage the bone that the Inverta implant, right? They engage the palatal bone. They engage that triangle of bone behind the central, behind the anteriors. And look at the premolars. I'm just thinking about premolars right now, because premolars, to me, it's like, I wish I could be a premolar dentist, especially number 4, 5, 12, and 13. Because here's the deal. Yeah. As soon as you cut an MOD, you're heading down to the root canal crown route, and then eventually that tooth's gone.
Implant magnets,
They're implant magnets, but here's the thing is, guess what orthodontists like to do? Is they like to give everybody like a real nice wide smile. And so they move these premolars just outside, right close to the bone trough, and the apex is sticking out, like out my cheek over here. So if I angle it this way, it's out my cheek, right? And guess what's over here towards my sinus? Like if I put over here, like what's over here? Guess what? That's where the Inverta can go. And with an off-angled, I can still, with coaxis, I can achieve now a screw retain restoration, but more importantly, John, most important thing is as important as the screw retain. I can provisionalize this with a custom tissue former or a immediate load temporary and maintain the volume that dual zone requires and that connective tissue requires. Like, this is key, this stability. I feel like, is this a game changer, John? I think it is. I really think it is a game changer in implant design, and I really feel like you talked to our surgeon that we use. He has the ability to place these in his office. We're going to go get our hands wet on this stuff and look out because it's coming to my office, right? Because
I imagine that the most challenging part of learning how to use this implant is not anything about stability or torque. It's about the angle correction, right? And we've got a surgeon that we both know who's works together with Southern as well. Placed a bunch of coaxis, the older coaxis implant, which was X-Hex,
right?
And which I'm not personally a fan of for anteriors. I don't really feel comfortable using external hex but now we have a deep conical connection in the Southern which is a much better connection. And if we could get a situation where we could figure out, and our surgeon I know is comfortable with this, how to read that angle correction, know where we're headed. You know, they were talking about basically placing the implant drill through the incisal edge versus
which is like a no-no, right? Which is a no-no
because it's a 12-degree correction. So if you head for the incisal edge and you place it to the depth necessary, then you automatically have 12 degrees of correction built in.
It automatically corrects it.
And you should be in the cingulum. And I think that's going to take a little learning curve. They also have a straight one that doesn't have the angle correction, which just even that, Wes, is a big deal if you don't have a root. Right, if you don't have a root heading sagittally out toward the facial. I mean, I definitely think I could see a big use for this.
Well, I think some of the things that we've learned about dental implants over the years is that the posterior is so forgiving and the anterior is not. And the other day, my wife, she's a hygienist, and she and I were post-oping she was doing a cleaning on a very nice patient that had that implant that I had placed in number 7 spot. And we had been monitoring some soft tissue loss around this implant, and he showed a case. It looked very similar to mine, and mine actually started to show the abutment. In this particular case, it was a gold hue abutment. Fortunately, this patient's not concerned about the soft tissue, this pink aesthetic score. It's a failure in my book as far as aesthetics. But I look at the type of implant that I placed there. It was a 3.5 diameter implant in a lateral spot, and did not achieve screw retain restoration. And I feel like that in a situation like this with coaxis, I could have set myself up for possibly a visit where the patient is sitting in the chair and it looks like a tooth, it functions like a tooth, the big aesthetic score is fantastic.
And really, here's where I feel like the rubber meets the road here, Wes. Here's your choice. If you're doing, in our opinion, modern anterior implant dentistry, okay, you have a choice. You can use a 3.5 placed into the area where the bone is in the proper orientation, placed at the proper depth. And you can use dual zone. That we're talking just a traditional straight wall implant, with all the right design features, which you're not going to talk through all that. And you can accept cement retained, right? Yes. Because that is what you're going to end up with. You can still maintain tissue in terms of dual zone. You can still graft properly. Now, the question is, are you going to get as much tissue as what you might get with Inverta? Maybe, maybe not. That's what he said. Or you can use Inverta and you can say, I'm going to put the implant in the same bone. I'm going to get probably higher insertional torque value because it's a wider diameter. And I'm going to be able to angle correct to potentially get screw retention, which for provisionalization is so much nice. You're not having to have the screw come out the facial. It's so nice. And I think, too, the volume of graft material we're going to be able to place to the facial is going to get us closer to achieving that 1.5 to 2. I thought it was interesting, at the end in the Q&A, somebody asked a question about implant platform depth because they're seeing all these immediates being put in deep because you have to put them in deep because everything's based on the mid-facial bone crest and tissue position. But now your implant is pretty deep interproximally. And he made an interesting comment. He said, that study that everybody likes to cite, the Dennis Tarnow, of course, his partner, and Salama published in 2000. They call it Tarnow's numbers sometimes. And he said, I feel very confident that if we redid that study with implants into extraction sockets, we would get much bigger numbers because people are asking, well, what about the papilla stability? And I'm telling you, we've seen his lectures. We've seen the follow-up now for several years on dual zone. He's saying they're getting better results on thin tissue rather even than thick. So he's basically saying like all this blood supply. So we're not so worried about papilla preservation here. We're worried about mid-facial volume and maintenance of that volume. And Wes, I mean, if we could predictably place Inverta in those situations instead of a 3.5 and kind of trying to fight for stability and being a little nervous when you're torquing on that provisional, you're like, do I really have 35 newtons or is it 25 or is my torque wrench calibrated properly? What if we had 95 newtons? And we didn't even have to think about that. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff about this that's very appealing.
And like he said, once you bail, right, on an implant surgery, like, so if you're in surgery and you don't achieve stability, you're never getting it back. Right now, I know that some of you may be listening to this and saying, I know people getting it back after how many surgeries and how many scars and how much morbidity.
Yeah.
And how much time.
Right.
It was made clear. It's been made clear that what we want to do is we want to provide our patients with modern techniques that require less surgery, less incisions, and less compromise to this blood supply. Because let me just say, it has been proven science that if you start doing stuff that to add surgical time and add surgical procedures to these sites, that the predictability just starts to drop, John. And on Friday, I feel bad for this guy. I mean, I'm glad that it's not going to turn out perfect. It's not going to turn out great. We're going to try to get everything back that we lost. But and you might be okay in your hands, right? I love how he says this: to the aesthetic restorative dentist, this implant is a game changer. And the reason why is because we're seeing the results 4, 5, 10, 20 years later, right? What's this going to look like? And rehabs, right? The bad rehabs, right, are the thread exposures. And listen, we don't want that. And I also think, you guys have to understand Tomas Linkovich's concepts. You have to understand that this fits right inside the zero bone loss concept way of doing things.
That's right. Horizontal component of biologic width, vertical component of biologic width. It's enhancing your chances of achieving proper biologic width around your implants. And one of the things, the quotes that I wrote down is, implant design cannot overcome biologic principles in wound healing, but it can work in tandem. And so it's so true that, no implant design is going to allow you to overcome biology, especially at 5 years. You might think you won on year 1 when you've got, 1 millimeter of tissue facial to that implant. But if you look at these cases, as Wes is saying, out over several years, you're seeing some stuff that's going to worry you and it's going to worry your patients. And we ain't got time for that. We want to have cases that we can do predictably here. So this is, I think, Wes, I think we can say, the dental guys are going to say, this is a game changer. And I'm eager to try this implant out. I'm not going to place it first myself. I want to see it placed. I want to restore a bunch of them. For me, that's kind of my comfort zone. I'm guessing you'll probably start placing it before I will, since that's kind of the way it rolls. But
I'll figure it out, and then I'll come and show you how to do it.
yeah, you can show me how to do it. Yeah, exactly. I'll just sit back and restore a few and watch. But I think that this, for the restorative doc, is a game changer. Provisionalization is key. You have to be able to make a good provisional or custom tissue former. But if you can team up with a great surgeon, or if you're the surgeon and you're also a restorative doc, you got to have both components on this. But if you got both components, Wes, I think this could be a way to really make a difference on our cases in the anterior. It's another tool in the toolbox.
There's a lot here to unpack.
Well, if you've listened to this, if you've listened to this tonight, and this is just a little taste, really, of what Dr. Chu talked about. We one of these days we got to get him on the show and really digest even more of this information, not just about Inverta, but we've definitely followed a lot of what he's taught over the years. But I think that if you've listened to this and this has helped you to get more information, reach out to us, let us know if you're using this implant. We want to know what you're seeing. We'd love to see some photos, some CTs, some PAs. We'd love to see some provisionalization results. How are you dealing with the angle correction? How difficult are you finding that? Is there a way to guide that? We've heard some rumors about that from Josh Campbell about how to deal with guiding these. There are maybe some ways to reverse engineer the guiding of these. But I think that there's a lot here that you can, and of course, go check out Southern Implants. Clearly, they've got a good product here, an interesting product that's worth trying out, test driving. We'd love for you guys to give us some love. If you're new to the Dental Guys, head over to thedentalguys.net. Check us out. Check out what we've been putting up on Facebook, what we've got on Instagram. Of course, there's a podcast that's audio. We've got 150 some episodes. We'd love for you to become a part of our family, of our little club of people that are trying to up our game and take our practices to the next level. It's been fun to get to do this little post show. We just love geeking out with you. So for Wes, I'm John, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Dental Guys.